Hello and welcome to a video on TCGplayer.com. Excuse me, my name's Steve Rubin. Today we're playing with a deck that I've played for a long time in Vintage, Dredge. This is a deck that is a little underappreciated, I think. I think a lot of established Vintage players would never be caught dead, so to speak, playing Dredge. It's a very high variance deck, but when played properly, you kind of, put yourself into position. Even though you're relying on luck, you're putting yourself in position to win using skill and decision making and sideboarding. So I think the deck's actually better than what people think. People generally think it's like a tier 2, tier 3 deck that, all you need is really hate, and then you'll be able to beat it consistently, which is just generally not true. So let's talk about the deck itself. So this deck is pretty much almost always about 50 of the same cards. You have the Bizarre Baghdad, which is how the deck works. And once you have the Bizarre Baghdad, draw 2, discard 3. You can use it to not only discard your dredge cards, but you can use it to dredge multiple times in a turn. And Serum Powder, which is the card that lets you mulligan. And I've never done the math myself, but from what others have said, it's about a 95% chance that you'll start a game with a Bizarre Baghdad if you're playing 4 Bazaars and 4 Serum Powders. So those are pretty important. That's why, iterations of that called Manaless Dredge, because you can kind of win with just Bazaar. And let's go ahead and talk about the Dredgers first. So you have 4 different Dredgers. You have Golgari Grave Troll, you have Stinkweed Imp, you have Golgari Thug, and you have Dakmor Salvage. Not really much to know here. I mean, the Imp and the Golgari Grave Troll have there's a huge bonus to dredge 5 or 6 than 4 or even 2, because it's just a situation where, you have the thugs because you always need a dredger, but for your deck to work really on all cylinders, you want to be getting those big chunks of your deck. This deck is pretty capable of winning on turn 2, which a lot of people don't know. People are very surprised sometimes when I kill them on turn 2. They're like, wow, you're an insane draw. When it's like, no, that's just your everyday run-of-the-mill dredge deck. I'm going to kill you on turn 2 if you're built the way my deck is built. So we'll talk about we talked about the dredgers. So interesting to note about Thug and Imp, and hopefully in my games I'll get into it, but you really need to understand that Dredge plays this sideways game plan where you're not really playing Magic. You're flipping your graveyard and comboing with cards that Narcomoeba, when they go into the graveyard, they come into play, but still know what all your creatures do. And for instance, Stinkweed Imp, it doesn't have Death Touch. It's a 1/2 flying that when it deals combat damage to a creature, it destroys that creature. But it's a 1/2 flying, and you can cast it for 3 mana. You do have mana sources in this deck, and it's really important to understand in what scenarios you should be hard casting things. Obviously, it'll be in decks where you're grinding out, but for instance, a Grafdigger's Cage does not stop you from dredging. So sometimes you'll get into situations where you can just dredge an Imp and play it, which gives you a great blocker. If it dies, you can just dredge it back, and you can still win from there. So just really, really don't give up on any game when your opponent is hating you out. I've also noticed that lots of times your opponent is not going to play optimally, almost ever, against you in most situations, especially when they have the cage, they've got the Tormod's Crypt, they've got their Tabernacle or whatever. They kind of, I'm not going to say they're going to check out, but they kind of underestimate the fact that their deck becomes very diluted when they have hate, and stuff like casting your Stinkweed Imp is a way of beating it. Another thing is Golgari Thug. So this has a must trigger. Put a card from your graveyard on top of your library. This is actually can be really good and really bad at the same time. The most notable thing you can do with the Golgari Thug is you can hard cast it. Then if you block or sack it, you can put Narcomoeba that you've already discarded on top of your deck. That way you're guaranteed to get it back, which a lot of games, if it gets real scrappy and you're slow dredging, or if your opponent has some sort of hate piece, that's kind of what you need to do. Bloodghast, same thing. 2 when it can't block, but if your opponent's at 10 or less life, it has haste. It only costs 2 mana. So if you get your opponent below 10 and you are being you're kind of nickel and diming them, Bloodghast is a pretty decent threat, because in Vintage there isn't that much removal, and there are creatures, but there aren't that much creatures. So when you're thinking about a game of Vintage, you're a 2/1 haste for 2, that's never going to do anything. It's actually more often, this is going to do something more often in a game of Vintage than it will in a game of Standard. Because in a game of Standard, like, people have lots of creatures, people have Whirler Virtuoso and Planeswalkers and stuff, and their deck can actually play like a fair, normal attacking and blocking game better in Vintage. And Vintage combat never, combat is a phase, but it's less used than in other formats. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place in this, but there's just so much to cover. So I'm going to try to get this done in as fast as possible without missing anything. So I guess I went over the dredgers and what they do. So I'll go over like the cards that make the deck work. So let's pull everything over. So I would say that these 12 cards are the cards that make your deck work the most. So you have 4 Narcomoebas, 4 Bridge from Lows, 4 Cabal Therapies. So if you're milling your deck, every time you hit a Narcomoeba, you get it into play. Bridge from Below, read this very carefully. Basically, the short and sweet version is whenever one of your creatures is put into the graveyard, you get a 2 non-token, you get a 2/2 zombie. And then if your opponent's creatures get put into the graveyard, which includes tokens actually, very confusing, your bridges get removed. But the most important thing to know, and if you're watching this as a Dredge player or non-Dredge player, the Dredge player does get to stack the triggers. So say your opponent, 2 creatures are trading, even though the bridges are being exiled, I can stack it so I get the zombies first, which in the very scrappy games, which are the games that you should practice the most, that's when bridge is the most important. And so bridge just kind of allows you to, when you fill up your graveyard, you get a bunch of bridges. Then whenever you sack anything, and we'll go over that in just a second, you get 2/2s. So you have 4 Cabal Therapy, pretty much one of the coolest Magic cards of all time, and just been used in so many graveyard decks and fair decks alike. But Cabal Therapy is your disruption. It gives you basically free disruption because you mill it into your graveyard, then you can sack a creature, which, like with bridges, you already want to do, and you can exile cards from their hand. So this is one of the reasons that this deck is so disgusting, is that if you don't just kill them outright, you can often mill 2 to 3 therapies, and pretty much any deck, if you therapy them 3 times, it's going to be very hard for them to come back in the game or just, play Magic at all, because you just get to pretty much obliterate their hand. A really awesome card, and this is the one card that you have to play a lot with to really get the most use out of it, because I think that if you're good with therapy, like you kind of change the whole dynamic of the Dredge deck. Like somebody that's just never played Vintage, might lose. Like it's really hard to say, because a lot of the games, it's really the games like the sideboard games and the games that you're losing where you have to like hit on therapies. But long story short, generally what you want to do with therapy is on the first therapy, you kind of want to name something that it's very likely for them to have. That way you get to see their hand, you get to maybe pull something out. Very often it's going to be Mental Misstep or Force of Will. Then that leaves you open to therapy them again and get whatever goodies they have, because there's a lot of one-ofs in Vintage, which is the downfall of therapy, is that sometimes like you're playing against a deck and the only thing you're afraid of them doing is like tinkering you, or playing a time walk with a bunch of stuff in play, or playing like I guess Bargain is no longer restricted, but playing like what is the best one, like Yawgmoth's Will or whatever. Like, yeah, ideally you'd want to be able to therapy that, but it's not usually that likely they have it in their hand. So unless you're really far ahead and only have 1 therapy, you generally aren't going to name a card like that. But understand that the power of therapy relies in its protection. So pretty much, yeah, I can help you like get cages or containment priests out of your opponent's hand, but it's like directly powerful. Like missing on therapy is okay if you're depriving your opponent of having a certain thing. Like say I name a Grafdigger's Cage with the therapy and I miss. It's like, yeah, I missed, but I named a very high impact card. So the fact that that card is not in their hand means you have a higher, even though you didn't hit with the therapy, you have a higher likelihood of winning. So stuff like that is really important to know. Then we have the kind of like mill me bonus cards, I guess I would say. 3 Dread returns. Now, this is kind of interesting part of Dredge. In different points in Dredge's history, you didn't necessarily need to play Dread Return. I think that Dread Return is good because it just makes your deck a turn faster. A lot of the time when you mill your whole deck, you can therapy them a few times in game 1, and then, you just end the game because you pick apart their hand. But Dread Return is like one less hoop to jump through. You can Dread Return an Alice Norn or a Kolaghan. You get a bunch of zombies from your bridges, and you generally kill them. I think that Dread Return does have a place in Dredge, and a lot of the times, like, when you're fighting through hate, one of the best things you can do is just kind of, like, get underneath their hate, which Dread Return can allow you to just kill your opponents faster than they can deploy all their hate, or, like, draw into hate, because there's a lot of, people might have a lot of preordains, people might have a lot of card selection in their blue vintage decks. So actually having Dread Return post board is sometimes, even though it's not good against hate because it doesn't really do anything on its own, it does allow you to kind of just have an explosion where you just, like, in one turn mill your deck and Dread Return. 2 Fate Stitchers. This is a card that is not that commonly played in Dredge lists, which I think is just completely ludicrous, because in game 1, like, having 1 or 2 Fate Stitchers in your deck, I don't have the numbers, unfortunately, but it greatly increases the chance you're going to kill your opponent on turn 2, because it turns any, like, Bazaar plus land hand into essentially a double Bazaar hand, because what you get to do is you get to unearth this, you can untap your Bazaar. Also, you can tap your opponent's permanents, which does include Trinisphere, which can be really cute, or you can tap blockers and whatnot, but generally you're going to be untapping your Bazaar, and then just siding these out immediately, because if they have any graveyard hate, you just don't really want them. But just the nature of Vintage is just a fast format, and I think playing, like, Mental Missteps or whatever over a card like Fate Stitcher is kind of an unreal, because, like, it's a card that matters in your graveyard, and this is, like, what I was saying, if you build your deck properly. I don't like 4 Fate Stitchers or whatever, because I do like having some interaction and a high Dredger count, but Fate Stitcher is, I think, a must-play. I just think that you have to play Fate Stitcher. I think that it's just so good at making you kill your opponent on turn 2, and it just gives you extra bodies in case you, like, miss on enough creatures to therapy. It's just another thing that lets you therapy and protect yourself. But other cards you want to mill are the Icarids and the Bloodghasts. I kind of went over Bloodghast already as a creature, but when a land enters the battlefield, it returns. It's pretty good because you can take, you can grind people out, and if you're sacrificing it to therapy or Dread Return, it'll just come back the next turn if you have an Undiscovered Paradise or another land. Icarid is pretty important. I've played 2 in the past, but it does make you a little more explosive, and is, like, kind of good when you're slow dredging. Obviously, it's the kind of card that is going to be bad when you don't have that many resources, like, compared to just a normal dredger. Like I could play Golgari Thug, for instance, over Icarid. That's why you only play 3. But anyway, like a card like Thug, if I only have, like, 1 dredger or whatever, one action spell I want to discard. Sorry, I'm not really articulating myself very well, but basically Icarid is, like, it's a pretty medium card. It's hard to get going, but it can help you get around. Tabernacle, which is really nice. It can help you get around some other stuff. Like, it is really good at taking out Planeswalkers. Sometimes people have Dak Fade in their Jace and try to, like, control you out while using hate. It's really good against that. And it also sacks at end of turn, so it does fuel your bridges. It's just like a free creature to help you get to 3 creatures so you can Dread Return. So we went over Dread Return, Mindbreak Trap. This is kind of a meta call. For a long time, I always played Leyline of the Void in this slot, but a lot of the combo decks now are Outcome or, like, Yawgmoth's Bargain. Before, against Storm, like against straight Storm, for example, Leyline of the Void is pretty good because it keeps them off of ever, like, playing a Yawgmoth's Will, which their deck is kind of built to almost do every game. But now that Bargain is unrestricted, some of the decks just play a bunch of mana and a bunch of bargains. And Mindbreak Trap is much better. Like, Leyline is so bad against that, but Mindbreak Trap is very good. This does make you a lot worse against Dredge. So it's kind of a situation where if you want to win the Dredge mirror and not just have a coin flip, you probably want to play Leylines. But I think part of Dredge is embracing the variance and to win a Vintage tournament, you're going to have to beat a bunch of blue decks, a bunch of Paradoxical Outcome decks, some Storm decks. And I think that, you'll take a coin flip against Dredge, and obviously you can make that like a 75% matchup or whatever if you have the ley lines. So it gets really weird if you both have ley line. But anyway, I think that trap is where you want to be right now. And then the last thing, I guess the last thing before the lands are the two creatures. I play one Kolaghan, one Elishnorn. Pretty straightforward. Kolaghan is your Flamekin Zealot. It comes in, gives all your zombies haste. You kill them. Really nice. Also is a black creature for Icarid. And there's not much to say about Kolaghan. Make sure you know that whenever they cast the creature or Planeswalker that's the same name, it's a card in the graveyard, they lose 10. That I think may have come up for me once or whatever. Just note all your cards. Like, I don't want to seem like I'm patronizing you guys, know what your cards do, but like part of winning with Dredge is just actually sometimes casting your things or whatever, and Kolaghan is no exception. Elish Norn is basically because it's a little bit less good now that Mentor isn't really a thing, but there are just a lot of decks like Delver decks, and against specifically like Workshop, I've found Elish Norn to be better than Kolaghan, because if everything's going right, it doesn't matter. Both of these cards are going to win you the game. But if everything's not going right and you only get to get like a little mini Dredge, you'd much rather have this card that they can't kill, that like kills most of their guys and pumps your team for the rest of the game. So that's kind of why you have a split, because a lot of times you side one out, and one is like against a combo deck, Dragonlord's Kolaghan's better, and a creature deck, Elish Norn's better. But they both pretty much do the same thing. Lands, so we have the Bazaar, we have the one Salvage, that way the Bloodghast come back. I've actually found this card to be kind of bad. Like, it's very, very rare when you're not already crushing your opponent that you're like, oh, I'm going to Dredge Salvage. Sometimes it's good because when you dredge like your entire deck, like sometimes a lot of good cards will end up on the bottom of your deck, and you want to dredge down to like 0 or 1 card in your library to make sure you get like all the Dread Returns are on the bottom, or all your creatures are on the bottom. So actually having a card that is Dredge 2 is kind of nice. I actually think that reason alone, like, I would maybe play it, because returning your Bloodghast is good, but not that great. Because you just don't run into that situation very often. 4 mana Confluence. I really like having a lot of lands. I think that for a long time people didn't play many lands, but being able to hardcast Therapy is really strong. It gives you like an extra therapy, because you can use that first therapy, find out what's in their hand, go after permission, and then like your subsequent therapies are going to be better. 4 Undiscovered Paradise, pretty much every single deck plays 4 Undiscovered Paradise. Good with Bloodghast. Does everything you want it to, adds mana. 2 Petrified Field. This is kind of like another, like Fate Stitcher, it's kind of another utility card. Not everyone plays it. I think you should play 2. I played 4 for a long time. I played 3, but to fit the Mindbreak traps in, I'm playing it. There's a lot of deck. If you play against any Shops deck, like, you really want it, because they can beat your slow dredge plan, because they have Ravager, they just have like Hangerback Walker and Ballista. They can just go kind of, play a bunch of good creatures and beat a slow dredge plan. So that's why you want to be able to return your Bazaar. Also, it's kind of like half of a mana source, because sometimes you can like have this in play and dredge into a mana Confluence in order to get it back. I like this a little bit better too when you have what is the card called? When you have Barbarian Ring, because then you can kind of, if they have a Containment Priest, you can tutor it up. So Petrified Field's solid. I think it's important to play, because especially when I play at Vintage Worlds, I know I'm going to play against Shops a lot. This just happens every year. Go over the sideboard. So this is kind of the new technology, is to have a Hollow One in your sideboard, because what it does is, in conjunction with Bazaar, it's just a 0 mana 4/4, which does a few things. One, it means like if your opponent has a Cage or Rest in Peace or Leyline or whatever, you can still just Hollow One them. And if you can play 2 Hollow Ones on turn 1 or in the first 2 turns, that can actually beat a lot of decks because post board, people sign in a lot of cards, and then what they do is they mulligan down to their hate. So they're often keeping very dysfunctional hands that just stop you from doing what you're doing. So if you can put a 4/4 into play, it can be really nice. The other thing that it does is it gives you like a 0-mana creature to get your therapies going. And post board, like therapy is a lot more important because you're hard casting it. Hollow One helps you do that. This is actually like a huge improvement for Dredge. When I first saw this, I was like, oh, that's pretty neat. And then after playing with it, I'm like, oh, this is really good. I've actually like yet to really kill my opponent with Hollow One, but it's still done a decent amount of work. Angler is kind of like the B Hollow One plan. It's a lot worse than Hollow One. It's just so much worse because it just costs you a mana. So you need the mana in play. But also when you have the mana, you're trying to use it for Cabal Therapy or Ingature or something. But I think it's still worth playing the Angler. Basically because it's like backup. Like if you have these creatures that you're playing, you kind of want more creatures as well. That way if they are locking you out of the game, like I've got 7 creatures, so I can get 2 or 3 of them in play more reliably. That's pretty much why the Anglers exist. I'm not really thrilled about them though. I might not end up playing them, but there they are. 4 Ingot Chewers. I think that Ingot Chewer is insanely good, and some of the lists that play Hollow One and Grim Angler aren't playing Ingot Chewer. Ingot Chewer is almost the reason that Dredge can be a deck because it gets around. It just gets around Mental Misstep, and it also triggers your bridges. So in those like grindy games, it's just so good against Cage because if you have bridges, you still get 2/2s when Cage is in play. And the Ingot Chewer gets to kill the bridge. They can't miss it, but they have to force to will it. And it's also, when you play against shops is really important, and it's a good dread return target sometimes to lock your opponent out of the game when you're really far ahead. Does pretty much everything you would ever want in a sideboard card. Maybe one of the best sideboard cards of all time I've ever played in any deck is Ingot Chewer. I've won so many games off of it. So that's why you have Ingot Chewer. Pretty straightforward though. Also, before Thorn of Amethyst was banned, it was really nice. Restricted. Did that happen? I can't even remember. Anyway, because you could Ingot Chewer your opponent. If they had a Thorn in play, you could still Ingot Chewer for 1 mana. Nature's Claim. This is just so that you can have more Ingot Chewer type effects. You can kill enchantments now with the Nature's Claim, which is pretty nice. Obviously, because people will have Leyline, people will have Rest in Peace. The other thing is it is an instant, which makes it so, like, for example, if they have a Cage, you can play a land, and with the trigger on the stack for landfall for Bloodghast, you can Nature's Claim it. So Nature's Claim is pretty straightforward. You should play 3 or 4 on your sideboard every time you play Dredge. Last card is a Mox Jet, which I'm not sure if it should be a Mox or a Black Lotus. A lot of times in the sideboard games, your opponent just like keeps a hand, and you kind of know that they have a hate card. So being able to go like turn 1, get your hate card with the therapy is really nice. And also the problem with Anglers is a bit slow, but it makes the Angler a little bit faster. It's possible this should just be a Black Lotus because it works a little bit better with Angler. But I've been playing with the Mox Jet. It's been okay. It's also just another mana source, which back for a long time I played like 8 lands that made mana, and then like that was more because shops kind of cut you off mana, but it's also sort of a lot. You will lose games because part of Dredge is just like you're gonna have certain parts of your deck and not other parts. Like for example, like you might have a Dredger, but return nothing good, or you might have like the Nature's Claim, but you might not have a land, and a lot of times you actually won't have the land. So having just more mana sources is good. And I'm going to cut it at that. Watch the matches to really get more about the Dredge deck. This was kind of just my real quick trying to briefly explain the most complicated deck, one of the most complicated deck of all time. So I hope I did an okay job for those of you that have played Dredge before, and also those of you that have never played it and are interested in it. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys for the rounds.